And to commemorate this historic event, we now have in our studio, I'd like to welcome one of the key players and main negotiators during the peace talks back in Helsinki, His Excellency Hannu Himanen.
Pak Hannu was also the Finnish ambassador to Indonesia from 1996 to 2000. So welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Well, now, Pak Hannu, what were the key challenges that you faced when mediating the Aceh conflict? Because we want to know this. And how was the Finnish and the Indonesian approach to conflict resolution evolved ever since?
Well, the key difficulty was, of course, that there was an open war going on in the province. As you mentioned earlier, the GAM, the Free Aceh Movement, was in arms. It was an armed rebellious group, and the Indonesian armed forces had a very strong military presence in the province. And it was open warfare. People were killed, and nothing seemed to work. There were talks mediated by, amongst others, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva for a number of years, and those negotiations resulted in a cessation of hostilities agreement, as it was called. But nothing moved. Finally, as far as I understand, the Indonesian military said no. And it was a deadlock. And for instance, during my period in Jakarta, 96 to 2000, Aceh was off limits for me as an ambassador. I would have liked to go there, but the Indonesian government did not allow diplomats to travel there. Right. So I was very skeptical. Even towards the end of the year 2004, when I was informed, I was then in Helsinki as Under Secretary of State in the Foreign Ministry. I was informed that something might be moving, and maybe Finland could consider being involved in a peace process. I was very skeptical. I said, well, I can take this up with my bosses, my superiors, but I don't think this is going to move. The situation was very uneasy. The GAM leadership was in Sweden, a neighboring country. And the Indonesian government was adamant about it, and the Swedish-Indonesian relations were very strained because of this. So I had no particular reason to be optimistic. And then came maybe a divine intervention, an outside, unexpected event, which was the tsunami. It was a shock also in Finland because I think almost 4,000 Finnish tourists were in Thailand at the moment, at that point. And at the end, almost 180 Finns died as a result of the tsunami. I was intimately involved in that process to repatriate both the living, the injured, and the dead Finnish nationals. But at the same time, very early on in January 2005, things started moving. All of a sudden, I was contacted by President Martti Ahtisaari, whom I had known since the early 80s, when he was a high UN official in New York. I was posted in New York. He was in touch with me. We had a discussion, and then he asked me to join him when he had the first face-to-face contact with GAM representatives in Helsinki. And then things started moving. So it's a combination of things that you always don't expect. But of course it took courage from both parties, both the Indonesian government and the GAM leadership, to take the decisive step to start these negotiations. But they needed someone to help them. Yep. Right. And President Ahtisaari was the ideal person for that.
Right, and obviously, unfortunately, many lives lost during that tsunami, but really a short time span between that and August of 2005 when the agreement was actually agreed upon. Now, we are almost 20 years on, 2 decades. If we take a look back now, do you think that the Helsinki Agreement achieved its intended goals that was set at that time?
Now, of course, I'm not intimately informed about the present situation in the province itself. I had a chance of meeting Mr. Malik Mahmoud, who was part of the negotiations 20 years ago. I met him yesterday, and I understand there are a number of issues that need to be solved. Of course, Aceh wants to have investment, its economic development really needs a lot of attention and so on. But all in all, if I look at the broad picture, first of all, it was highly unusual that a peace process, a process of negotiating a persistent conflict that had gone on for years and years and years, and was basically in a situation of open military conflict, could be not only negotiated, but negotiated in a way which resulted in a peace agreement, which was Mr. Ahtisaari's principle was to keep it simple. The document is relatively short. It, particularly compared with this earlier agreement, or draft agreement, the COHA, the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, was a very lengthy and detailed document. Mr. Ahtisaari wanted to avoid that sort of situation. He wanted to have a very generally formulated document which the parties could agree upon based on trust that could be built between the government and the rebel movement GAM. And he succeeded, or he helped the parties to achieve that. And the peace has held, which is the most important thing, which is not at all typical if you think of international conflicts, be they within countries or between countries, that an agreement achieves more or less a sustainable peace. And this is the most important thing, because without a peaceful situation where people resort to arms on both sides, nothing else works. Peace is the precondition for any development, any economic and social development, for the welfare of the people. So in that sense, I think it was a remarkable achievement, but the real heroes of the process are, of course, the negotiators on the side of the Indonesian government and on the side of GAM, because they took a huge risk, and it was worth taking that risk.
And, I guess the key to making it all work, I mean, simplicity, keeping it simple, obviously makes it a lot easier for both sides to agree to this.
Yes.
As well.
And remarkable achievement indeed. So do you think that we can apply the Aceh conflict resolution model to other cases in Southeast Asia or the region maybe?
Well, I think each conflict situation is very unique. You cannot replicate.
Yeah.
But of course there are some principles that you could keep in mind, and I'm thinking of how President Ahtisaari approached his task. He made it very clear in the very beginning, in the first joint session of the two delegations, what his preconditions were, and it was that independence for the province of Aceh was off the table, which was very difficult, of course, for GAM to accept. And then he said, of course, fighting needs to stop, but finally, I'm not the one, he said, who makes the peace between you two. You have to desire to reach an agreement. and you own the conflict. You have to negotiate between yourselves. So he really took the role of the mediator, not putting himself in the center, but rather pushing the parties to face each other in good faith, and gradually, in a relatively, or actually very short period of time, period of few months, he managed to create an atmosphere where trust and mutual respect was built between the two parties. I think this is the single most important lesson of the process.
And I think that is where it really takes a unique perspective of a neutral party, so to speak, to be able to just help resolve a conflict, as opposed to having interjected themselves in the situation themselves, like the situation we're seeing in Myanmar, for example, in the Southeast Asia region as well. Perhaps it has been ongoing now for a couple of years, and it will take some outside intervention, perhaps, to be able to find some way to mediate the conflict between the two now. Obviously, you have spent time here in Indonesia, and things have evolved a lot in our country as well. What is your take on the current state of let's talk about the potential of Indonesia at this point, compared to conditions when you were here as the Finnish ambassador to the country?
Of course, the time that I was in Indonesia was a time of historic change and transformation for Indonesia. I remember very well when I arrived in Jakarta in '96. My expectation was that I, as the ambassador, will mainly try to promote Finnish business interests in Indonesia. There were major Finnish companies such as Nokia and others who were here, and I was available for them and participated in all sorts of business promotion events. And then, less than a year after my arrival, things started moving in Southeast Asia. It started with Thailand. In the early months of '97, the Thai property market started going down. It crashed. And then I remember at some point in June, July '97, the World Bank representative publicly stated that the fundamentals of the Indonesian economy are so strong that Indonesia should not be worried. It took a few weeks, and the IMF was in town to bail out Indonesia in September, October. So it was a very rapid development, and obviously Indonesia at the end of the day was the country in Southeast Asia that suffered the most of this crisis. And of course, then the deep economic crisis led to a political crisis, which erupted in May '98. It was a very dramatic month with violence, fires around the city, a lot of fear amongst the expat community, the Finnish business community, as the other European and other expat business communities were extremely concerned, and finally we organized the voluntary evacuation of any Finnish citizen who wanted. We had 2 Finnair flights diverted from Singapore to Jakarta, and 200 to 300 Finns were helped to leave Jakarta. And for instance, the journey from downtown Jakarta to Soekarno-Hatta airport was dangerous. It was we had to time it carefully, and it seemed that the police did not work properly at the point, so we had high risk, but we managed to do it, and it was the economy was already going down, so many of the business people who left did not come back because there was no prospect. But of course, the reform of the political life started with that.
That's right.
First with B.J. Habibie, and then with Gus Dur, Abdurrahman Wahid, who became president. And it was, a lot of things happened, and it left me with a very strong impression. Now, at that time, when I left Indonesia in the year 2000, it did not look good at all. Indonesia was in a multi-year crisis and a low point in its economy and so on. But to the extent that I have been able to follow Indonesia in the subsequent years, Indonesia has become a major player, not only in Southeast Asia, but also more and more globally. It is the, if I'm not mistaken, the fourth largest country by population in the world. Population continues growing, approaching 300 million.
The young population is huge as well, the youth population.
Yes, yes, and of course a country of lots of natural resources, starting with oil and gas and minerals and you name it. So economically, Indonesia has great perspective. Of course, it is in a region which is sort of, in many ways, an interesting playground of various factors, not only because China is in the neighborhood, China being, of course, an important partner to Indonesia, but also a source of all sorts of concerns. Only to mention South China Sea and the Taiwan situation, there are tensions in the region. Sure. But if Indonesia plays its cards carefully and wisely, it will be an even more important player, even globally, in the future, and definitely a regional leader, which can show the way for all of Southeast Asia in the future.
Amen. And hopefully that potential is recognized in the coming years as well. Real quick before we let you go, Your Excellency, we're curious, obviously, 25 years on, you were here at a very challenging 5-year span. What are some of the things that you missed most about your time here? We heard you like to play golf,
yes, you're quite the golfer, we heard.
Definitely, yes. Golf in Indonesia was marvelous, and I still play golf, but in very different conditions than Indonesia. But what I miss, I think, most is really the people. I mean, the longer I stayed, the more Indonesian friends I had. Yeah. Of course, for a diplomat, you can really. You may have the illusion of having personal friendships, but most of them are there because you are what you are. You are in an official position. Sure. But I had lots of Indonesian friends with whom I could gradually be convinced that they were actually very friendly, and it was a personal relationship. Many of those contacts have disappeared in the subsequent years, but I have very fond memories of many occasions, and then also in very official connections. The communication with senior government officials, starting with, for instance, the presidents, B.J. Habibie and Abdurrahman Wahid, and the foreign minister Ali Alatas, and senior foreign ministry officials. Even though it was a tense time, we had the East Timor, the Timor-Leste conflict, which was very difficult. It happened to culminate at the end of August, beginning of September 1999, when Finland had its first ever presidency of the European Union. So I was the spokesman for the EU for the second half of the year 1999. And I remember situations where the EU ambassadors went to the presidential palace and had a very open and frank discussion with President Habibie. And then when we are coming out, world press was there. And I was interviewed because I was the spokesman. And years later, I met people who said told me, "I know you from CNN."
I remember hearing it.
But despite the difficulty, the difficult atmosphere and very complex political issues on the table, the communication with Indonesian, senior most Indonesian representatives was always amenable, friendly, not confrontational. We disagreed, we knew that, but we could talk, and that's something that I think tells a lot about Indonesia and the Indonesian people.
Civility. Glad to hear it, and wow, it's been really insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your experiences with us and all of our viewers as well. And we do hope that a lot of what you have said, many of our viewers can take from, as well as comes to fruition as well. Your Excellency, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Appreciate it. All right, we're going to step away for another short break here on the 2-hour news show. But when we return, Yanni Hill will be back to share with you some of the latest from the world of economics and business.
That's right. So your business updates is coming up next after the break. Station right here on the 2-hour news show on See Today.